Welcome, everybody, to another fantastic lesson from Pace AI's Foundational AI course for educators. This is Lesson 4, What is Bias in AI, and how do you protect your students from it? Now, listen, as we learned in previous lessons, these large language models are built and fed upon humanistic data. Data from the internet, data from literature, data from the past and present. And we have to be honest with ourselves. The past is rife with bias. And so, how do we protect our students from bias in AI? And how do we protect ourselves from outputs that may contain biased statements or incorrect statements? Well, let me give you an example. Let's go back to this amazing picture of Superman talking to his father. Now, how can bias have infiltrated the responses from Superman's dad? Well, as we talked about in our previous lesson, the data set that is creating Superman's father and his voice and his responses is all Kryptonian. And what if the Kryptonians have a bias against humans? What if the Kryptonians believe they are smarter and better and more ingenious than the humans? Maybe within the writings, they speak down about humans. Well, if that data, if that information is in the data set, then when Superman asks his father, what do you think about humanity? He might respond with something that, oh, they are not smart. Oh, they are not intelligent. Because that is the bias found in the Kryptonian data set. Now, this is all hypothetical because Krypton is not an actual planet and this is just a DC comic book figure. But because of where the data came from, it was rife with bias. How do we know the data being fed into these large language models have removed bias or don't contain bias? How do we know this? That is what we need to be asking ourselves when utilizing these tools. Are these companies helping to mitigate bias by putting up guardrails within their systems or ensuring they're not including bias information into their data set for these machines to learn from? These are things we have to bring up, and these are things we have to talk about in education. Again, how can AI be biased? I mean, it's so evident when looking at image generators, especially when image generators first started to become popular in early 2023. You see, if you put in the prompt a Mexican person, based upon the images that these machine learning models, these large language models have been fed, these are the kinds of images that you would see, right? An older, mustache, gruffy looking individual with a 10-gallon hat or a sombrero. There's so much bias here that it's so evident. A couple of them, again, the way that they are dressed, the way that they are portrayed, the way that they are all men when we asked a Mexican person, right? This doesn't reflect the true nature of a Mexican person. I myself am of Hispanic descent, and I don't look like this at all. But this is what the computer, the large language models, generated, because that's what their data set basically told it to produce. Now, I have to say that a lot of these image generators that are out there have mitigated their bias greatly through a couple different techniques, and we're going to talk a little bit about them today. So, how do we mitigate bias? It's a two-pronged approach, right? Like when an educator asks, "What can I do as an educator to ensure that we limit as much bias as possible?" That's what we're going to look at of the user, but also we have to rely on the developers to put up guardrails in place, right? So, for example, what can the user do? Well, the user can utilize the power of prompting to be as clear as possible through well thought out prompts by employing processes like a negative prompt or a fair prompt. Like a negative would be something such as do not include, right? Fair prompting would be utilizing language that maybe not be gender specific. For example, in my vocabulary, when I'm looking for the mail, I say, did the mailman come? When in fact, I just mean the mail carrier. I'm not really talking about gender, but because of my vocabulary, and because if that's the way I ask the large language model to present an image of a mailman, it's going to give me a male, a man. But if I change it up to a mail carrier, right, that might give me a different response, right? Fair prompting techniques. These are things that we as educators can help train our students to do. And then the developers, right? We must put trust that our developers are putting in rules and guardrails, right, to prevent these biases from the data sets. We don't want them to leak out into the generated outputs, right? These are things that we have to put trust in our developers to do, or maybe be a little bit more vocal to the developers to ensure that they are mitigating these biases, again, by putting up rules or guardrails in place so that the outputs are not prone to these types of biases. And we have to acknowledge that bias exists. I think this is something that truly allows us to understand humanity, that bias has been in existence for as long as humanity. We see bias in history. We see bias in regional aspects. We see bias every day. We still see bias, right? And so by acknowledging that bias exists, that truly helps us craft amazing prompts to remove those biases. But I also want you to know that many tools out there now, especially image generating tools, do something called shadow prompting. They call it prompt optimization, but I call it shadow prompting. And basically what it is, it's put in there to give a better output, right? For example, I may ask, please give me an image of a mailman delivering mail to a home, right? And if it just takes that prompt, it'll give me a man as a mail carrier delivering mail. But to correct that, you might get a little bit of a shadow prompt where it re-engineers your prompt to say a mail carrier, both male and female, it'll rewrite it to ensure that a bias image doesn't come out. I have nothing against shadow prompting, but I do think it does need to be acknowledged that that is what they are doing, right? But know that is kind of a guardrail they're putting in place to ensure that you're not getting those images that we saw at the top of this lesson. And we also have to know that sometimes this can lead to overcorrections. Sometimes by trying to mitigate bias, you overcorrect. So maybe historical images are no longer historically accurate because they've overcorrected in these biases, right? So we have to acknowledge this in order to correct this, okay? So that is what we are asking for you to do. Now, these are some things that you should be following every time when writing a prompt, when using prompts, and when using large language models. First, you need to clarify what you're asking. That's prompt engineering. Be as clear as possible using negative prompts and fair prompting in order to get the machine to understand what you are truly asking. Remember, the T in ChatGPT, the T in BERT stands for transformer, and it uses the context of your prompt to then give you an output. The more context you add to your prompt, the more clarity you add to your prompt, the better the output will be and the less bias will be in those responses. Next, verify. We need to acknowledge that not everything these large language models output is correct. We need to acknowledge that not everything in these outputs are free of bias. We need to look over the outputs to ensure that the information is true it's factual, and it doesn't contain bias or harmful responses. We need to not only train ourselves on this, but our students as well. We need our students to understand that not every output is giving you factual information, right? They need to verify. And then finally, modify. If the output is not giving you the response that you wanted, you need to do a follow-up prompt to then try to get a better output. Never take the first output. Never take the first output. Always do follow-up prompting. That means ask it another question. That means ask it to do something else. Ask it to say, like, I liked the very first paragraph of this response, but the second one, here are some things I did not like. Please recreate this for me with these guardrails put in place, with these follow-up asks put into place. Customize that output to meet your needs. And then let's say the output only gives you 85% of something you wanted. Take the 85% that works and you add your 15% to finalize it, right? But notice in these steps, who is always involved? A human. A human should be involved at the beginning, writing the prompt. A human should be involved in the middle to verify the output. And a human should be involved in the end to modify and finalize. Clarify, verify, and modify. 3 amazing steps when utilizing large language models in your classroom and in your professional practices. Thank you so much for joining us for this extra special lesson. We are excited to conclude Pace AI's Foundational AR course in Lesson 5. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful